Kia ora tātou. Hope everybody can hear me. I'd like to talk to you a little about the EU-New Zealand FTA, which at this point is one of the government's top trade priorities. And it's fairly obvious to most why that's the case. It is our third largest trading partner, and two-way trade with the European Union is about $22 billion in the last year. But also it's one of our biggest relationships. It's one of our most closest relationships. It's one of our most complete relationships for all sorts of reasons. In the economic sphere, it's the world's largest trader of goods and services. It's the world's largest single market area where people, goods, services and capital move freely. And until recently, New Zealand was one of only half a dozen or so members of the WTO that didn't have a preferential trade agreement with the European Union, or were in the process of negotiating such an agreement. So that's now changed. After 9 years of discussions and 2 or 3 years of very close preparation, these negotiations were launched by Trade Minister Parker and EU Trade Commissioner Malmström in June of this year. So we're looking at this agreement to remove tariffs and other barriers, of course, that face trade. But importantly, in our message to the European Union is by doing so, we can create opportunities for people to work together, to collaborate, and to be more competitive and successful in each other's markets, but also in third country markets. We hope that this agreement is going to bind in a very ambitious level of openness for services and investment, and thus contributing to greater stability in the business environment. Despite traditional differences over agricultural trade that are well known, the EU and New Zealand are very like-minded on trade and are heavily committed to this rules-based system that Vangelis was talking about. We also have a very strongly shared commitment to a progressive and inclusive approach to trade, the Trade for All agenda. We both call it the same thing. We both have a Trade for All agenda. And so our leaders on both sides want this agreement to set a new benchmark for provisions relating to sustainable development, including climate change, labour and environment, for the empowerment of women and their aspirations in the economy, for the Māori economy, and some things that we've also been trying to address for a long time, small and medium-sized enterprises and how we ensure that they can benefit from the agreement. And that also relates to the regions as well, how we can ensure that regions benefit from free trade agreements. Negotiations have already begun. We commenced negotiations in July in Brussels. We're going to be pursuing this Trade for All agenda in the FTA, but we've made it very clear to our partners that we are undertaking this Trade for All agenda right now. The process goes through to the middle of next year, and we anticipate that there will be some recommendations, some ideas that we will want to bring back and inject into the negotiations before we complete it. And thankfully, my counterparts are very open to this idea. While there are many commonalities of our approaches, we can expect some areas of the negotiations to be challenging. And these were quite clearly identified in the scoping discussions that we've had with the EU over the last few years. First of all, on agricultural market access, New Zealand's approach in all free trade agreements is to seek comprehensive tariff elimination for all goods. At the same time, the EU's sensitivities with respect to certain agricultural goods are well known, probably most acute in areas like beef and dairy. First of all, we want to level the playing field with the European Union. As I say, at the moment we're discriminating against each other in trade. We're offering better access to other trading partners. First thing we want to do is eliminate that discrimination against third parties. But we're also going to be guided by the principles of fairness and reciprocity. For primary product producers and exporters in New Zealand, we face in some areas some very high tariffs and tariff rate quota restrictions, which restrict the volume of trade, in contrast to the very open access that the EU enjoys into our market. So this disparity has to be rectified. It has to be addressed in the negotiations. But it's not all about agricultural access. We know that there are other barriers that our producers face in the market when it comes to services. We want to, and also trade and manufactured goods, we want to address some of the non-tariff barriers as well. We've already identified a range of areas where we might seek to overcome some of those non-tariff barriers in areas like trade in organic products, like trade in medical devices. The EU is very interested in the automotive sector. I don't think that's going to be too hard with us. Wine. This is our opportunity to have a wine agreement with the European Union and to remove some of the non-tariff barriers when it comes to things like certification, laboratory testing, and the like. Another area of the negotiations that are going to be challenging is intellectual property. We start on a pretty sound basis with the European Union. We both have very strong, efficient and effective regimes for the protection of intellectual property, but we do differ in our perspectives in a number of areas, and these mostly relate to terms of protection for things like copyright or patent term. These things are going to be looked at in the negotiations. We don't know what the EU's ambitions are in all areas of this. Our position is clear. The terms of protection we have for these areas of intellectual property in New Zealand is right for us as we see it at the moment, and we will defend those positions in the negotiations. But we'll see what comes at us. Those issues have to be looked at, of course, in the overall context of the benefits and costs of the agreement. One area of intellectual property that needs a few words is geographical indications. So these are names that are attached to goods such as wine and some foods that indicate a quality or reputation linked to where the goods come from. This is a major EU offensive interest. We agreed in our scoping discussions that we would consider the protection of geographical indications beyond wine and spirits. New Zealand already has a system of protection for wines and spirits that was implemented last year. But we said we'll do this only in the context of a satisfactory overall outcome in the agreement for New Zealand. And for us in particular, this means market access. We have to, as I say, address this question of the disparity between their access into New Zealand and our access into the EU market. For some of these same products where they want protection of names, for example, cheeses. Government procurement was another area that we identified in the scoping discussions as an area which might pose some challenges for us. New Zealand and the European Union already have wide-ranging commitments to non-discrimination between us. That's part of the WTO agreement on government procurement. And this applies to all of the entities that we have covered by these agreements above a certain threshold, which is about worth about 400,000 New Zealand dollars. However, the EU has some ambitions to go a little beyond that into areas that we didn't commit in the government procurement negotiations in the WTO, particular areas like local government purchasing. New Zealand, because of our very centralised system of purchasing, we believe that we probably commit everything now that the EU is interested in, but they see an issue of reciprocity because their commitments in the GPA can go down to quite a low level of local government. So that's something that they will press us on in the negotiations. At this stage, we don't know how far they are going to seek to go. So that's another area for the negotiations. One area that won't cause us issues in this negotiations is investor-state dispute settlement. This is not included in the EU mandate for negotiations, so it's off the table. And as Vangelis has already mentioned to you, in any case, New Zealand's policy is to oppose the inclusion of ISDS in trade agreements. Commissioner Malmström, when she was here in June, was very clear on this point. She said, we don't need this in the FTA. The right to regulate, I won't go too much into this because I think the question has already been addressed. It's very clear that both New Zealand and the EU will seek to ensure that the agreement protects that right to regulate. And again, Commissioner Malmström made that very clear in her discussions while she was here in June. The EU has already agreed to include New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi clause in the FTA. Their own negotiating mandate is precise on this point, so that's something we don't have to spend a lot of time convincing them about. So we're off to a good start in that respect. So as I said, we've had our first round of negotiations. This took place in Brussels in July. We have another round coming up next month when we host them in Wellington. And we look forward to a really good engagement with New Zealanders on the terms of this FTA. Thank you very much for your attention.